You just found the perfect product that helps with staying cool during hot summer runs. No more gross warm water. Stay cool with this product from Gear Handle. This hydration tube cover helps keep your water cool and easily accessible. Stay hydrated during those long summer runs or even delay from freezing in the winter. Plus, they're compatible with various brands of water bladders and come in various colors. Visit gearhandle.com and use promo code H2O today.
Coming up on the Payoff, Mike Van Meter is as established as they come. A United States Navy helicopter pilot, he served during Desert Shield and Desert Storm, then moved on to be a D.C. cop, Washington, D.C., and was an FBI agent for over 2 decades. But the one thing he couldn't beat, one thing he couldn't overpower with his will, was his addiction. Mike now works in the healthcare field, or should I say in the addiction field, and he carries his message of experience, strength, and hope every day in a professional capacity, but he does it here with us in a personal capacity. Mike Van Meter is an incredible guy, and he was an incredible guest. But first, I'm actually going to be a guest at this guy's place, Kevin Souza.
Hey, Pete, you there?
Yeah, I'm looking for Van Meter Wellness Solutions, LLC. Is this it?
Let me go. Let me see if they're in. Let me see. Hi, this is Van Meter Wellness Solutions. How are you?
There you go. Yeah. Well, look, I need all the treatment you can find me, pal. So I guess I called the right number.
You did. You did. Well, that was a good thing because you're not armed in there. You have to learn to talk your way out of situations, and so you get kind of good at it. That's where you learned all the verbal judo. Because I need to get people to do things that they really don't want to do, but they got to do anyway. But you don't have any way to make them do it. So you have to use your mouth to get it done.
It's bad enough as an alcoholic, you probably already were a manipulator, and then you learned all these skills, right?
So it came naturally.
I just want to go through it here before we get started. 8 years as a U.S. Navy helicopter pilot. You served in 2 wars. Career as a corrections officer, DC cop, and then an FBI agency. And at some point, we get sober. It's hard after talking to you. I was on your Recovery is Possible podcast last week. But it really is hard to imagine such a decorated individual hitting any kind of bottom. How did that happen?
Well, that's a good question. And the thing is that I think that that's part of why I'm doing the work that I'm doing right now, because my specialty really is first responders and military people. And one of the big myths is that people like myself and people that are successful and accomplished can't hit a bottom. And the fact is that people like that do. There's this stigma that surrounds addiction, and I know you're very well aware of that. And it's something that I've really devoted the rest of my life to combating. This stigma is something that has to be eradicated because I think the general public has this perception that people that have addiction issues are people living under the bridge and people that are homeless. And there certainly are those individuals. And we're doing what we can to help them where we can. But the fact is, that's actually a very small percentage of the people that struggle with addiction. The fact is that most people that struggle with addiction are people that are working in society that the other people in society might look at and say, hey, that's a successful person. And some of them are wildly successful. You and I both know those people that are wildly successful that yet struggle with addiction issues and mental health issues or a combination of the two. And when I first came into recovery, that's what I dealt with. In my profession, if you think about my background and I entered, when I first went into training for the Navy, I was 19 years old. And I'll be 57 here in a few months. And if you think about it, from the time I was 19 to now, I was conditioned to not be powerless over anything. I mean, if it's a fight, I'm going home. You're not. You come to me for help. I don't go to you for help. If you think about it, as an FBI agent, as a police officer, people. It was amazing. It always amazed me as a FBI agent in particular. Like whatever the subject is, people thought I had an answer to that. If you wanted to certainly know about criminal issues, you'd ask me. If you wanted to hear about something in the news, you would ask me. But people would say, "Hey, what do you think of the stock market?" Like, what the hell do I know about the stock market? But it was like this aura that was around you that people thought, well, you're an FBI agent, you should know everything. Now, if you juxtapose that over to now an FBI agent needs to be in recovery, and your whole life has been people come to you for help, you never go to anybody else for help, but now you need help, then what do you do? And step one, for the people that are listening that are familiar with the 12 steps, the first step is I'm powerless over alcohol and my life has become unmanageable. And of course, you could take alcohol and replace that with anything. And, it's powerlessness on manageability. And that was really looking back on it, sort of doing the postmortem on my recovery career. I think that was really the big issue. The thought that I could be powerless over anything was foreign. It was not in my DNA to feel that way. And I did not get any semblance of sobriety until I absolutely understood that. And I think that was the big part of it in overcoming that. So I know in my profession, in the FBI, the police department, the Navy, all of it, all those professions that you just mentioned that I was a part of, I knew people that needed to be in recovery. Mine progressed. It took a period of time for that to develop, but I knew people that certainly needed help. And in fact, the funny thing is when I was a naval officer, I sent many of my troops to treatment to get help. And back then I couldn't understand what their problem was, why they couldn't get well. So it's that myth, Pete, that we deal with, that people that the public might think, quote unquote, has it together, can't have these issues. We absolutely can. And we all know somebody. We all know somebody. Pete, I'll just share this with you. One thing. I speak in front of a lot of groups now. And one of the things I do in the beginning of every talk I do is I ask the audience, who in here knows someone that has an addiction issue and you feel that they need to get help with it? How many of you know somebody in your life that fits that category? Do you know, Pete, that I've never not had an audience where every single person raised their hand? Every single person raises their hand. That's the extent of this epidemic that we have, really. It
touches everybody in one way or another.
Yeah.
And you got
everybody.
So when did you get sober? What's your, I like asking people this question. And with you, I've learned a lot about you as a professional, as a military guy, as a police officer, as an FBI agent, or I'm continuing to learn more. But I do have a question around when exactly you did get sober. What is your sobriety date?
My sobriety date is August 12th of 2012. So we are in July. So about a month out. Wow. I'm about ready to hit the double digits.
And so were you retired from the FBI at that point?
No, I was still in. I was still in the FBI. And oh, by the way, I got to do a shout out. My sobriety date and my wedding anniversary date are the same day. How about that? How cool is that?
How does your wife feel about that?
You know what? It's awesome. It really wasn't planned to be that way. And I'm assuming that we'll kind of run through my story and talk about how that happened. But it just happened. It was the same date. It makes it easy, for planning. Instead of having two expensive dinners, we can just have one expensive dinner. So that's always nice. And it's always easy to remember both dates now. But it's kind of symbolic too, because like a lot of people, and if you are in recovery or if you're struggling right now, maybe you can relate to this. But Pete, I've been married to the same woman for 33 years. This will be 33 years. And in law enforcement, that's an amazing accomplishment, period, because the divorce rates are in it just in the profession alone. And then for alcoholics, addicts, that's an amazing accomplishment. So you put those together, my wife and I have defeated the odds, that's for sure. Because that's the one woman. I don't have 5 marriages that I've added up to get 33. It's to one person. So. You can't add them all up. You can't.
When was the first time your mind was altered because of a substance? Do you remember? Is there something you could circle on the calendar growing up as a kid or as a young adult?
I don't know the exact date or the exact age, but I grew up. And alcohol, by the way, I'm just going to throw out. For me, my presenting substance is alcohol, and I'm, it's because it's illegal, right? And if you think about my professions, I was never, from the age of 19, I was never in a position where I could do really anything other than alcohol, if you think about it, because I was always in professions where you were tested and particularly when I was flying, very, very, very strict regulations on what we could and couldn't do. So that limited me to alcohol, number one, and two, prevented sort of the progression of, those of you that are familiar with addiction, it's a progressive disease. And so I would say it sort of stopped or slowed down the progression of it. But as far as the early days, I would say maybe 12 years old, because I grew up in Clearwater, Florida, which is a retirement community. And basically Clearwater, Florida is, people around the country, they're in working states. Like I know you're from Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a working state. Ohio, New York, people, these Michigan, people work in these cold places and work hard, and they decide to retire and go somewhere, sit in the sun before they die. We used to call Clearwater God's waiting room. And it was God's waiting room. And so I grew up in the mid 70s, late 70s. And the people in our neighborhood it was the World War II generation, the Great Depression, that era. They were retiring at that time. And these were hard people. They grew up during the Depression. Many of these guys lied about their age to go into the military during the Second World War, and they're not even out of high school, and they're fighting in Europe and in the Pacific. And these guys didn't grow up with hug rooms and safe spaces, and that was not that. They didn't do that. These were hard people, and the way they looked at it was, hey, if I can go fight in Europe or in the Pacific, and I'm 16 years old, and I can drink. And they drank hard, and they drank whiskey, and they drank beer, and there were no kids in my neighborhood. It was just these people and us. We were the only family that had kids, and so my parents would throw parties and just have people over. And these old guys would just turn to you and say, how old are you? And I'd be 15. Oh, okay. Well, here's a whiskey, because they were doing that when they were 15. And so I do remember starting my drinking very young, and not 15. I mean much younger than that, but.
That's a really interesting perspective, man. I've never heard that before when you talk about that gritty, that tough generation. If I can fight in Europe, I'm certainly going to be able to enjoy myself. And drinking was, like you mentioned for your own story, it was legal. Yeah. It was everywhere you looked, right? I mean, commercials and I know my father's family, it was pretty much promoted. Drinking and having a good time. Yeah. And it sure as hell looked like fun. I think I went to bed before most of the madness, or I didn't understand maybe my dad's temper and the way that he would flare up was related to his alcoholism. It didn't, I never put it together, but drinking looked like fun. And that's a really cool perspective to have on it, a historical perspective, right? Of those guys and that grew up like that in that hardcore generation. And to be around that and to kind of have grown up around that.
Absolutely. I tell you, I do podcasting and you do podcasting. And one of my, I wouldn't say regret. I mean, they didn't have podcasting when we were growing up or recording, but, most of those guys have passed away. And I would pay big bucks to be able to go back and record, like you and I are recording right now, conversations I had with these guys, because they all had their story. And you know what? That was the pivotal event of their life. It didn't matter. They could become a neurosurgeon, a lawyer, name an electrical engineer. It didn't matter what they did after that, because we would sit at parties and you get these guys liquored up a little bit and you say, hey, Mr. Smith, I heard you're a neurosurgeon. Yeah. Whatever. Hey, let me tell you about the war. That was the event of their life, man. It did not matter what they did after that. And that stuck with me. And that really kind of drove me into the profession, because I was always intrigued by the adventure, by the, you could just tell this was just such a mark on their life. And I wanted a part of that. In fact, when I was a kid, I thought, man, just too bad I wasn't born in that era, because I think I would have fit. I seem to almost relate more to that generation than my own generation. Because these guys, they loved their country, they knew that they were part of history, and they they knew that they were fighting evil too. I mean, World War II was truly, if you could talk about good and evil, it was definitely good versus evil, and they knew that, and I always respected that. But that kind of drove me into the military and law enforcement, actually.
And you're growing up around the quote unquote good guys. You're seeing them, drink a lot, and you're seeing them have fun, and it's like, why wouldn't I be moved towards that lifestyle to serve my country? And this is like a great bonus. When did you start to kind of see alcohol having more of a role in your life as you evolved?
Yeah, well, looking back on it, and again, you and I both being in recovery, we can look back, and particularly with some of the addiction training that I've had over the last couple of years, I can look back and I can clearly see things that were there, the marks, the stamps, but, it was not evident then, because for those that are listening that may be new to addiction, you have a couple of things here. You have the social environment, like what we're talking about. So I'm around all these people that are drinking heavily. And then you put in the biological, physiological factors, right? So you have a genetic uploading or a predisposition, and then you couple that with social environment. And you really need to have the two that will go together, right? Or one fuels the other, let's put it that way. So what I didn't mention was that addiction runs in my family. My mom died of her alcoholism. Both of her parents died of their alcoholism. And I don't know the rest of the family line, but certainly those two. And then on the other side, my dad's side, you have the process addictions, which are, those of you that aren't familiar with process addictions, those are addictions that you can have where it's not putting the chemical in your body, but it can be addictive. For example, eating is one of those. Although you put in your body, it's still considered a process addiction. Pornography, gaming, gambling, those would be process addictions. And so that happens on the other side of the family. Now you put that together, that means that I was already genetically preloaded for that. And when I work with patients and we go through the biopsychosocial assessments and we go into the history, nearly all the patients that you work with will have addiction somewhere else in their life. In fact, I would imagine you had it somewhere.
Oh yeah,
am I correct?
Yeah, my dad's family. Yeah, there was big time alcoholism on that side of the family.
Yeah, see.
And the first time I drank, and it's for me, I don't know if it's like this for you, it was kind of a load off when I finally accepted that I had this disease and this addiction issue, because I was a sick person and there was an opportunity for me to get well through getting sober and through stopping it. Whereas for a while I felt like, well, alcohol and drugs are this gift and they're going to be stolen from me. And at some point I kind of saw for what it was, is this thing's killing me. And it's not me. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with me. I can change this. Now the alcohol is making me do things, and those things by definition are making me a bad guy to be around. But I knew that I had the light in me. I just had to flick it on, and get sober.
Yeah, well, it's that acceptance. And there's a chapter in the big book, and in that chapter, it talks about acceptance, right? Acceptance of your condition, of your alcoholism. That's a prerequisite of this, because it's there, it's genetically. And the big book also talks about how people that are not alcoholic, and we can extrapolate that to other drugs as well, but people that are alcoholic have the feeling that we get, the sensation that we get from alcohol is different than non-alcoholics. My wife is non-alcoholic. And I know, back when we were dating in college, and if she would have...
Where'd you go to school?
More than Florida, University of Florida.
Oh, okay. Gator, okay.
Yeah, University of Florida in the mid-'80s, and, big party school. And that was actually part of my story too. But when she and I started dating, if she had more than 2 drinks, it was that, I'm feeling kind of lightheaded. I'm feeling tingly, and I don't like that. And I never understood that when we were dating, because I'm like, yeah, that's just the ride home. That's what you mean. I like that feeling, but you see, she's not alcoholic, right? So and I won't bore you with the physiology behind it, but there's physiological reasons. There's a euphoria that you and I get from drinking that non-alcoholics do not. It's not the same feeling, and in our brain, it's a miswiring of the survival mechanism, where when we get that feeling, your body then takes a substance, which is alcohol, which is actually a toxin to every single cell in your body. It's a poison. It's something that your body should reject. Just like if you were to drink Clorox, like a bottle of Clorox, your body would immediately reject that, and you would purge it, and you would shut it down. You need to see treatment. Well, alcohol is also a toxin, and so if you think about it, when you drink too much, what happens with your body? Your body,
It rejects it.
you stop, you throw it up. You might have to get your stomach pumped because your body needs to get rid of it, right? But what happens in our body is that feeling, that miswiring, the genetic miswiring that we have. Your body, your brain, because this is a disease of the brain and the body. If your brain then looks at this, and because of the miswiring, it says, "Hey, not only is this not bad, but it's good. And if it's good, we need more of it," because your body looks at it as survival. And we will drink it until our death, because ultimately it's about death. And Father Joseph Martin, who was the co-founder of Ashley Treatment Center, which is one of the places I went through treatment, he used to have this line.
Are you paying attention, folks? One of the places. So this guy's, this is an interesting story here. Keep going.
Yeah. You caught that very well. We'll circle back to that. But Joseph Martin, Father Joseph Martin, he used to do the famous Chalk Talks. If the listeners have never seen that series, it's a classic. You need to see it. But
it is, yeah.
He always talked about alcohol is the great remover. It's a great cleanser. It's a great remover. He says it's great for cleaning grease, dirt. You can actually remove lacquer off of tables if you need to do that. But it also is very good at removing lives, careers, children, dreams, professions, and those things. It's the great remover. And that's what happens.
Wow.
And also, addiction is the disease. Remember, it's mind and body, and it's the disease where your brain actually tells you that you don't have it. It tells you that you don't have it. And anybody that works with addicts and alcoholics, and I see this every day. In fact, I was working with some individuals this week that it's like their brain is not capable of allowing them to see what is painfully obvious to everyone around them. That's what addiction is. That's what addiction is. It's the disease that tells you that you don't have it. So
it still does today, by the way. If people are listening to this and they're sober for 30 days, 30 years, they will probably agree with us that it remains that disease that tells you that you don't have it, which is why you have to continue to practice your coping skills and doing stuff like this, just talking to other alcoholics, sharing with them. I love talking to other alcoholics. I've talked to you before, and there's an energy that we share, and there's a curiosity that I have around your story. And you mentioned the University of Florida. You go there. That being a big party school, did that foster your drinking career?
Yeah, you must have read about that in Playboy magazine. They talked about that, didn't they? That we were the number one party school in the nation. But then again, it was not fair to compare professionals to amateurs.
So what was your drinking like in college?
Yeah, well, okay, so that's interesting. So I went from high school where, I told you about the environment, and just, this is the early 80s too, and it was a different environment. I mean, I would do things drinking-wise that if my own kids did it, I would be horrified at it. I mean, we would go to keggers, we would go to drinking parties, in high school where, you're driving, you can't even see straight, driving down the street. And, back in those days, you could get pulled over by a sheriff or a police officer, and it was just more like, hey, where are you going? I'm going over there. Well, okay, get home. I don't want to see you out on the street. Okay, yes, sir. Those days are over, but that's the way it was back then. And it was almost promoted. So, but speaking of that, remember we're talking about genetic pre-uploading and environment coupled together. So I go from that environment to now I'm at the University of Florida, but I'm also in Navy ROTC. All right. So two things there. One, University of Florida, absolutely party reputation. Okay. And it was part of what you did when you're there. Now, couple that with, I go into the Navy. Well, the Navy has a party reputation, the military in general, and there's a drinking culture in the military. Pete, did you see the new Top Gun that just came out?
I did, yeah.
You did? Well, there was no helicopters in there. That was the only part that was down. I mean, the real pilots in the Navy fly helicopters. That was the downside to the movie, but. But did you know that now that I point this out, now this is 2022, this movie comes out. Did you not notice how many of the scenes revolved around the officers club and drinking?
Yes.
Did you not see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is 2022, right? Now, the first movie came out in the mid 80s. And if you go back and look at it, if you doubt what I'm saying, go back. The movie tends to center around drinking. Well, that's kind of how the Navy really was, only the drinking was much harder than what they depicted in the movie. In the military, there is definitely a culture, and in law enforcement, by the way, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit, but there is a culture in the military of drinking. I think it's better than it used to be, but it was definitely there. The Navy had a reputation for drinking. And, when I went to flight school in the Navy, some of my instructors were Vietnam era throwback guys. I mean, so it was even worse. Remember this tailhook? Was like, if you remember all the fiasco with tailhook, that was this group of people that were coming in. And when, on the weekends, we worked hard. I mean, let me tell you, the military, naval aviation is no joke. Flight school is tough. Deployments are tough. It is. But when we were not on deployment and we were in port or we were in the squadron, if the commanding officer said, "Hey, we're going to the officers club," that was not a suggestion.
Yeah,
you were going.
I had a guy.
You drank.
I was lucky enough to have a guy on here who had like 150 something combat missions in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Flew F-4s, and he said that his name's Colonel Dan, and he always, come hell or high water, literally, like if he wasn't in the air fighting, he was in that officers club like every night for I don't know how many years. And it's just the way it was. And just like you said with the guys you grew up around, this guy went on to be wildly successful financially. But really all he wants to talk about is his experience in the military and what he did with his brothers in Vietnam. And I did find that to be a very interesting thread through his story, that it just seemed like it was like part of the curriculum was hardcore drinking.
Yes, yeah. It was expected. It was expected of you. There was no. I don't remember anyone ever saying, no, sir, I'm not going to go. Just so you know, I don't drink." I don't remember anybody ever having that discussion. And when you were on deployment, no, you got to remember too, flying, we had very strict guidelines in bottle to throttle, which we and I.
What's bottle to throttle?
Would respect that. But you have so many hours that, and it's true. The airlines have this now. How when your last drink to when you can actually get into the cockpit and fly, that's very strictly regulated in the military. Back when I was in the Navy, it was even our standards were actually even more restrictive than the FAA. But the FAA actually drives those guidelines. So there is a minimum number of hours that you have from the time that you drink to when you can fly, and we respected that.
Do you remember what it was for you?
It was 8 hours back when I was in the Navy. I believe. Now, I haven't flown in many years, and so if there's any pilots out there, I've heard that it's 10 hours now.
Okay.
But it was 8 hours back then. Now, keep in mind that's when you're in port and you can drink. Now, when in U.S. Navy ships, when you're on deployment, there is no alcohol in Navy ships, and so that rule was really not relevant when we were at sea and on deployment because it's just not available. But when we would pull into a port, I'm sure that most of the towns that we pulled into were very happy to see us leave by the time we left, because it was, and you got to remember too, and I think the American public doesn't understand that your average pilot in the military is in their early 20s. You got to understand, I was 23, 24 years old, flying multi-million-dollar aircraft into combat zones, and on the back of, I flew off of the frigates and destroyers, the small ships. I'm landing, a helicopter on a pitching and rolling ship at night in the rain. I'm 24 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, you understand that, right? And when you're on an aircraft carrier,
it's hard for me, a layperson, to wrap my mind around that. I mean,
these guys, the average age on an aircraft carrier is 20 years old. I don't think most people understand that. So, we played hard, we drank hard, and we did very dangerous stuff. And
did you find any of your drinking behind some of these moments? I mean, you've probably, I would imagine, seen and heard it all. And did you, even though, like you said, I guess because, like you said, those guys were just pretty much the guys you grew up around. It goes back to those World War II guys. Drinking was part of the culture. I don't want to hear about your feelings.
Yeah.
Did you?
Oh, nobody talks about feelings.
Yeah. Was there a lot of drinking to kind of cover up the experiences that were happening throughout the military?
Yeah. And then you just couple that with, I like the feeling. I like the feeling of being buzzed. I like the feeling of being drunk. And I think you and I both would,
Yeah.
if we were truly honest, if you and I could have that feeling now and do it without consequences, we'd probably do it now. Right.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just I think the feelings, you know what, in my story, I actually think the covering of the feelings didn't really have anything to do with the military. It came later. It came later as it progressed, because, I did do a career shift and went into you got to remember in the Navy, there was death and destruction. And I would be faced with, I'm talking to a guy in the wardroom, they call it where the officers get together in a ship, a wardroom, one day, and the next day, they've crashed, and this guy that you just ate dinner with last night's now dead because he crashed an aircraft into the water. And those were my first early death experiences, but they were occasional, right? And when it comes to combat, I was a pilot, so it's not like it was up. Anything we did was up and close and personal. It was later when I got into law enforcement, where, particularly big city, I was a DC police officer, and death and destruction was in your face, and it was every day.
Yeah,
I think was more. That was when the drinking to mask feelings became more apparent.
And let's go forward to that, and don't let me skip over anything major. If there's anything, because your story, there's a lot to cover. Part of your helicopter.
Because I'm old now. Yeah.
No, before you were old, if you want to call yourself old, you still have plenty to talk about. As you move forward, there are experiences, like we said, fighting in the Middle East, fighting in combat zones, fighting in war. And then you end up being a corrections officer, which you mentioned to me offline. You developed the art of verbal judo, because you can't have weapons as a corrections officer. So you learn how to cultivate that silver tongue. And then you move into law enforcement, and Washington, D.C. as a police officer in what, the 90s, late 80s?
95, 96. Yeah.
What
Up until I went into the FBI.
What the hell is that like?
I love that. What the hell was that like? It's funny, because I always tell people I work for Washington, D.C., and they're like, even other cops are like, oh, man.
Yes.
It was, I don't know how people do that for 20, 30 years. I really don't, but it was a great experience. So here's what happened. So when I was in the Navy, you do seashore rotations when you're in the Navy, and my wife was also Navy. I think I mentioned that. If not, I'll mention it now.
Okay.
She's actually retired. She's a retired Navy commander, so she stayed in. So what happened was, I had in the mid 1980s, the Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, the sea services all go to flight school together, and they had redone the flight. The aptitude test that you have to take to go to flight school. So to beta test that, they have the captured audience, which is all the people at the academies and the OTC units and OCS. And so they made everybody take this exam so they could get like a baseline beta score, for the test. So we were all forced to take this exam, to include myself. Well, apparently I did well on it. Now, I didn't know that at the time. I just took it because they made us take it. Well, when my wife and I, who was my girlfriend at the time, became dating, it became apparent to everybody that we were going to get married. In fact, we put out that we were going to get married. So now, remember, if you're a Navy or ROTC, if you're a Marine Corps option, you're part of Navy or ROTC because it's Department of the Navy. But they are different branches of the service. And so, in our ignorance, I guess that didn't really occur to my wife and I, but they knew that. And my Marine officer instructor came to me one day and he said, "Hey, look, here's the deal. You're going to go into the Marine Corps. She's going to go into the Navy. They are different branches of the service. You're either going to have a career or you're going to have a marriage, but you're not going to have both. Just so you know."
You mean they wouldn't change the rules for you?
No, not at all. Not at all. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
There's not that much feeling in the military.
I'm realizing that with life in general. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way.
No.
And so I was thinking to myself, well, why is he having this conversation with me? And he says, so here's the thing. You did well on the aviation exam, and you did well enough to be a pilot, actually. He goes, have you ever considered going into the Navy, or would you consider going into the Navy and flying? And I'm like, well, why are you asking me that? Well, it turns out that my wife had been selected to be an aviation maintenance duty officer to oversee maintenance of aircraft. She knew that that's what she was going to do when she finally got commissioned. And they said, look, if she's going into aviation, so she's in the aviation community, and if you go to flight school, then there's a better chance that we could keep the both of you together if you were a pilot.
Huh.
Now, that's not even guaranteed, but it's a better shot than what you have right now. And so I actually took a couple of weeks to sit and reflect on it, and I'm probably the only pilot in the Navy that actually was offered a flight spot and took 2 weeks to think about it. But I did. And that's how I ended up in the Navy, flying. And so what that meant was it was great. I loved it. I loved flying. It was a great experience. You talked about the military and those experiences. If you think of my 8 years in the Navy, the totality of my career, which lasted like 32 years, 8 years of it is just a fraction of it. But it was definitely the largest impact on my life, period. Even more so than the police department and the FBI, to be honest with you. I spent 21 years in the FBI. The Navy had a much bigger impact on me for a lot of different reasons. In fact, as I sit here in my home office right now and I look around at all the displays I have, more of them are from the military than even from law enforcement, to be honest. Because there's something about the military that bonds you with people. There's something about the training is flight school is no joke. Imagine having the worst final exam you've ever had in your life, but you're doing it every day for 2 years. Imagine that.
Well,
Imagine that.
You look at I can always bring it back to sports, right? I mean, you look at the Army-Navy game every year. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? And the camaraderie that you see in the stands more so than on the field. I think for the average person to get a 35,000 foot from above look down at that once a year is just. It's fulfilling for me as an American. I know I absolutely love it. And you can tell. And that's one of the things I love about recovery and talking to you. And even when I went to treatment and I lived in a halfway house afterwards, I started to understand. And I was an athlete, right? And I didn't understand the magic of what being an athlete was, being a young guy, the camaraderie that comes with that. The lessons I was taught at the University of Richmond about really like interracial skills, right? Like being around people of different cultures and getting to know them. Yeah. And you talk about removing stigmas. I mean, it was out of there. And I got to imagine the military on a much greater level, on a much more intense level, is so attractive. And it's got to be
unbelievable.
Yeah, it's got to be
and
a
I'll
high
tell you what,
octane.
it was. You talk about racial issues and religious issues. I mean, when you're in the military, you're thrown in with everybody. It's America. The military is if you talk about equal opportunity and equal equality, it's the greatest experiment in the United States. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, you're thrown in the Navy. You're thrown on a ship with every religion, every race, every sexual orientation. I know. Bringing in transgender people, homosexuals, things like that into the building. That was always I'll be honest with you, before it was ever an issue in the public, like the general public right now, it was always like that in the military. I mean, in the military, it was pretty open. As long as nobody was bothering anyone else and there was respect amongst people, then people were just left alone to do whatever they wanted to do in the military. Again, as long as you're not disrupting other people. That was a great skill to bring to the table back in those days. And I think that's why it had such an impact on me, and then just the closeness. I mean, you can talk about bonding with people, even in the police department. We can talk about the bonding, the thin blue line and all that. And it's there probably more so than the rest of society, but not like the military. There's something about being thrown onto a ship and sent on to the other side of the world, and you're literally living with these people 24/7. You're spending more time with them than you are with your own family. There's no way that you can recreate that in any other environment in American society, because at the end of the day, as a police officer, you're still going home at the end of your shift. But, in the military, going home meant you went from the flight deck down to your stateroom where you're still, in my case, as an officer, I was down there with 8 other guys. And, and some of the other sailors were in a room full of 60 guys. I mean, you're never alone in the military. You're never alone. But it builds a camaraderie that you can't recreate anywhere else.
But you found that camaraderie you mentioned to a degree as a police officer in Washington, D.C. How did your drinking progress as you switched from the military into being a corrections officer to being a police officer? Was there problematic drinking that was popping up at that time?
Yeah. So let me backtrack a little bit, because there's, in most alcoholics and addicts' lives that are in recovery, there's 2 pivotal moments that I'm finding that people have, and it was certainly true of me. Let me backtrack to Iceland a little bit. Now, remember, I was telling you that on flight status, very, very restrictive ways of living your life. A lot of people don't know this, but when you fly in the Navy, I can only speak for the Navy, but we weren't allowed to take aspirin. If you took aspirin, you had to report it, and there was a good chance that you were going to get grounded, because the idea being that if you're having to take aspirin or Tylenol, then that might be indicative of another problem. So we need to take a look at that. So very, very restrictive. Now, when I went to this was a short tour. So when my wife and I went to Iceland, Keflavik, Iceland is where we were stationed. And because that was her sea tour, because it was a remote duty station. And we were both of us were part of the staff of the base there. Now, I'm not on flight orders, right? So now I'm not flying in Iceland. So I don't have all these restrictions on me. And so the drinking started to progress a bit more. And part of that was the isolation. I felt, I had a little bit of bitterness. I have to be honest with you. I had just spent 3 years at sea. And for a lot of people in the Navy, your shore tour is kind of like a break. You can go to someplace a little bit nicer, maybe go to Navy postgraduate school, do kind of like a little bonus round type of thing. Whereas I'm like, they sent me to Iceland. They're like, well, yeah, but we'll let you spend time with your wife. Okay, yeah. But I'm on Iceland's a beautiful place. I love the Icelanders and all that, but it is a rock out in the middle of nowhere, and the sun doesn't come up half the year. And so the drinking started to progress. Yeah, it was. But there was if you're Icelandic and I'm listening, look, I love you guys. I love the place. It was not you, it was me. Okay. And when we were there, so the drinking progressed a bit more because I could, right? But
where are you drinking in Iceland? Is there a tavern? Are you drinking at home? How's that go?
Oh, no, on the base. On the base.
Okay.
Okay. Iceland's one of those places where if you were American, you had to live on the base.
Okay.
So we lived on the base. And it's interesting because my office that I worked in was across the street from the base housing we were in. And then across from the street from that was the officers club. So it was like this triangle. Wake up, go to work all day, go to the officers club, drink, stumble home, get up and do it all over again. And you do that for a couple of years.
Is your wife saying anything about your drinking at this point, or is she so busy?
Yeah. It was starting to be like, hey, you're starting to drink more. Why are you doing that? But there was a key moment, a moment I will never forget. And we're living in junior officer housing. And so all the junior officers are in this one building. And I had an Air Force guy on one side and then a Marine captain on the other side. And this Marine captain, he was a very cultured sort of guy. And what I mean by that is, he liked to read literature. It was interesting because he was a coat and tie kind of guy. And what I mean by that is, like, if he invited you to hang out at his house, he was in a coat and tie. And he would send you an email saying, I'm requesting that you be in a coat and tie. And you're like, dude, I'm just hanging out at your house. Yeah. Coat and tie. Right. So I don't know what that's all about, but that's the way it was. Right. So he invites us over. And what I didn't mention earlier, remember I was talking about all the World War II veterans.
Yes.
They were their thing was men drink whiskey and beer and women drink wine. So from the earliest days, I'd never had anything other than whiskey and beer because I was always told that's what men drink and women drink wine. So I'd never had wine in my life ever. So we end up at this guy's house and he's very cultured and, we're listening to classical music and talking about literature as if I know anything about literature. And, but I'm doing my best to play along. And this guy starts pouring wine, red wine. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness. Boy, this is extreme. We're drinking wine. What guy drinks wine? And it was a Cabernet. I know now that it was a Cabernet. And I remember drinking this. And for those of you that are listening that are looking for a PhD thesis to work on, maybe you can study what the chemical interaction is between the grapes in red wine and alcohol. Because at the end of my drinking career, and when I go to AA meetings now, I hear a lot of people talk about how their drink of choice is Cabernet, red wine.
Yeah.
A lot. I mean, I hear a lot of people say that. So there's a correlation. So there you go. There's your PhD thesis right there. But anyway, so this guy gives me a Cabernet, and from the minute it hit my lips, Pete, don't you know, it was like the world opened up. I think for a lot of alcoholics and addicts, it's like you realize when alcohol was the answer, and then you also remember when it was killing you. Okay, but this was the front end of it, and that was it hit my lips, and there was something about Cabernet that it was like a different, relaxing buzz that was more mellow than anything I'd ever experienced. And it was, I remember to this day that feeling where I'm like, this is the answer to everything right here. And I turned to my wife and I'm like, wow, I really like this. Cabernet, why did you never tell me about this? And she looked at me and she said, you told me that only women drink wine. And I said, you've never listened to me in our lives up until this point. Why would you listen to me about this? And so that became it. And so red wine actually became my drink of choice from that day forward. And then it progressed from there.
We'll get back to this conversation in a second. But right now, a word from our sponsors. But that was a major turning point for you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, those of you that are listening, what you need to know is addiction is progressive over a period of time. That meaning frequency and the amount. And so the amounts at the time, what I thought was a lot of drinking at the time really was not what it was later. It became more of just a way to relax in the evening, and again, I'm still in the military, so that was. And by the way, in Iceland, remember this is Viking stock. These are the old Vikings that moved to this island, and they drank a lot. They liked vodka, and they drank a lot of vodka, and so we would do that, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary because I actually don't even know back then if I was even really drinking more than the people around. There was a lot of drinking going on. Now, this is where the career shift took place. So I'm in Iceland, and I know that I want to go into law enforcement. But this is, for the kids out there, this is like we had internet, but it wasn't like it is now. And this is back when you would apply for jobs. You actually had to go to the place that you're applying for a job and get a paper. I know this seems archaic, but that's what it was. You had to fill out a paper application and deliver it to somebody. And then they would call you back and then say, if they called you back, can you come in for a written exam, psychological assessment, whatever it was that they needed you to do. So in Iceland, they had what was called the rotator. So on Friday evening, they would have a plane that would leave, a military airlift plane that would leave Iceland, go to Norfolk, Virginia, and then Sunday evening it would come back. And so there was this rotator, right? It was a cargo plane. And so I would fly back on Friday evening from Iceland. And think of my life at this point. I'm flying from Iceland to Norfolk, Virginia. I would rent a car and I would go up and down the East Coast of the United States, filling out applications to put into various departments. Oh, yeah, yeah. Then I would fly back Sunday night to Iceland.
How long is that flight?
Oh, about 6 hours, I think.
Okay.
If I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I was doing this every week, right?
Yeah.
Twice on the weekend. And so might have been more than that. I don't remember, but it was a long flight. And by the way, it's in a cargo plane. I'm not in an airliner. I'm in a cargo plane.
Yeah.
Air Force cargo plane. And so I would drive up and down the East Coast, and I would apply, and then I would get if they responded, hey, can you come back for a written exam? So I would fly back the following weekend, and in different departments, mind you, and I would take a written exam or a psychological exam or an interview or whatever they would want. And so I'm going through this process. And by the way, at one of those trips, my home of record was Tampa, Florida. Remember, I'm from that area, and in the military, you have what's known as a home of record because you're moving so much. So even though I'd lived all over the place and had lived in Virginia, I'm still a Florida resident at this point. And so when I had on one of my trips back to do this, I'm visiting my younger brother, and we had white pages. If you remember those, the yellow pages and the white pages. And I'm sitting in my brother's house, and we're going through the phone book, and I'm looking at police agencies that I'm going to apply to. And I get to F and Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I told my brother, I said, man, wouldn't that be funny? The FBI. Can you imagine me working for the FBI? And he's like, they could never hire you. And I just, as a joke, I was like, yeah, but I wonder how far I could get into the process before they just laugh at me and tell me to go away. She goes, well, you should apply. So I did. And, on one of these trips, the FBI said, hey, why don't you come on in for a written exam? And so I flew to Norfolk, rented a car, drove all the way to Florida, took the written exam, which I completely thought I bombed. And I thought, well, that was a waste. Just imagine Norfolk, Virginia to Tampa, Florida. And then drove all the way back. And so driving all the way down, drive all the way back just to get on a plane to fly to Iceland. Okay. Just to come back the next week. It's insane. The stuff that I was doing back then. It was just, but it showed the motivation, and the drivenness that I had. But I was doing that. And I remember, and this is kind of a segue into the story a little bit. I remember at one point, my mom called me, and she said, hey, listen, there's a letter came in the mail from the FBI. And my mom was like, why is the FBI talking to you? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't even know if I told her that I'd applied to the FBI. And she's like, what should I do with this? It's like all the secret. What should I do with this letter from the FBI? Get an attorney? I said, oh, no. I know what that is. I took an exam, and I failed it. Mom, I did horrible on that. I'll tell you what. I'll open it and I'll read it to you. Oh, no. I was so embarrassed. Like, Mom, I know I did horrible on that exam. Please don't embarrass me. And of course, Mom being Mom, she opens it up. She reads it, and it says, congratulations, you've passed the phase 1 exam. And I'm like, Mom, you're screwing with me. And she goes, no, this is do you want me to send it to you? I'm like, are you serious? I passed that exam? I passed it? She said, yeah, that's what the letter says. Oh, okay. So keep that in the back of your mind. So I didn't hear from the FBI, but there's a phase 1 and a phase 2. This is phase 1, which is, in my opinion, the harder of the two. So I passed it. Now, meanwhile, I get out of the Navy. I discharged from the Navy, go to Norfolk, Virginia. My wife had orders to a base in Maryland. So we knew we were going to be in the D.C., Maryland area because that's where she was being assigned next. And to my surprise, I didn't realize how difficult it was to get a law enforcement job. That kind of showed my ego and like what I was thinking of myself. I thought, hey, I had a master's degree by then. I'm a lieutenant commander select in the Navy. I was a helicopter pilot. Obviously I'm God's gift to you, right? You should be honored that I'd come to work at your place. And I found out that's not the case. And nobody really gave a damn about me or my background. And it's actually very, very hard to get a job. And so as I get back, it really just bothered me that I was unemployed. It just did. And I was like, I can't not work. And so I just read somewhere, hey, they're looking for corrections officers down here at the sheriff's office. And so I took it. And so I worked for about 6-8 months as a corrections officer. And what an experience that was. Holy cow.
What was the drinking like there?
It increased. Absolutely increased. And
was there kind of like, because I look at your career and you start to soar, but you mentioned that you probably were in love with being a corrections officer. It was a short stint, and you were unhappy with what you said, being unemployed.
Yeah.
So was there like a depression?
I wasn't unhappy with the job. I actually liked the job.
Oh, okay.
In a lot of respects, but it didn't pay anything. It didn't pay anything. And
by the way, I'm imagining the guys that you were working with, right? Your coworkers.
Yeah.
Your colleagues, they're probably not as evolved as you.
Not as what?
Evolved as you. And not
evolved?
Yeah, not having the experience. Not trying to get you to go out and, talk poorly about guys that are corrections officers, but you just seem like a guy who was destined for more.
Yeah, I think so. Looking back on it, yeah, I think so. I think it was apparent to them and to me. Well, and to me, I knew that this was going to be a temporary thing. And to be honest with you, even when I got to the police department, I knew it was going to be a temporary thing because my sights were set on going federal law enforcement. Now, you'll hear as we go on in this story, though, I'll circle back to that. That I think the best time in my life, law enforcement wise, was this period. Believe it or not. I loved it. I'm a people person, like you're a people person. I love the engagement. I love not knowing what you're going to get into every single day, the excitement of the job, which I lost. Really, hey, hold on one second. Oh,
Yeah.
now they got the blower out. These guys are killing me.
I can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't? Okay,
No.
good. I'm sorry you're going to have to do all this editing.
No, you're fine.
So, yeah, I think that it was interesting because this is where I kind of learned people skills, as I mentioned to you, verbal skills,
Yeah.
and psychological skills with people. And let me just kind of, and I haven't talked about this in a long time. It's interesting, but I think it kind of fits into the conversation a bit. That when I was there, I think everybody just wondered why the hell I was there. They're like, so let me get this straight. This job, which you really don't even need a high school degree to do, but you have a master's degree and you were a pilot in the Navy and you're a lieutenant commander, department head. Like, why are you doing this job?
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. I was trying to be nice about it, but I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that that was what a lot of people were thinking, right? And it was, but you know what's interesting is that a lot of people think that way, but I can't even put into words how many of the skills that I learned in that environment I used later in my career as an agent. That you can't go to training to get. You can't pay for that. It was immeasurable. And when I was a DC cop, where we worked alone, most of my patrolling was done alone. And the ability to talk to every single type of person you can imagine at the bottom of their life, being in jail, where they've got nothing to lose, and me being able to convince them to do things that they don't want to do. And I don't have weapons to do it. I have to convince you, okay, like I want you to move from that cell to that cell, and you don't want to go. And you got nothing better to do than to screw with me all day long, but I need you to move. And to develop the verbal skills to get you to do something you don't want to do is invaluable. And I don't know where else you learn that than working in a jail. But what's kind of interesting is where I worked, and then you learn psychology with people, right? So in the jail that I worked, they had like pods, and so they would have like a pod with 40 guys, and then another pod with 40, and so they have all these blocks, and we would do these rounds. And so you would go in and you would do rounds in these blocks, but the doors would lock behind you, and it would be you unarmed with 40 guys in a block. And they're in theory, supposed to be watching you on camera as you're going. So if there's a problem, then they can get to you. Right. Well, people being people, sometimes they would forget, or they go to the bathroom or whatever, and you're locked in there, and they forget that you're there.
Jesus.
And yeah, oh my God, if you want to wet your pants, there's nothing like being in a situation where you need to leave the block, and you're waving at the camera, and the door's not opening.
Oh, and can the guys tell that like that you're waving?
Oh my God, now you have 40 men who, some of them are waiting trial for murder. There's gangbangers, and they know that the people in the control booth don't know that you're there. And you know that they know that they don't think that didn't remember that you were there. You want to talk about like
fear,
a stressful feeling.
Yeah.
Right. But there's a way, but you learn to work with commands. There's a way that you carry yourself. There's a way that you just the way that you carry yourself. You come across as though you are somebody that can handle yourself in no matter what situation. So just kind of a little funny side. I haven't even thought about this story in a long, long time. But the prisoners didn't know that when we would work in our control booth, just the way the acoustics were in that jail, you could hear everything. Everything that was being said in the block, you could hear where we were. Now, they didn't know that. And I remember one night, just working overnight, and some of the guys were talking about how they were, how they hated all of us, and sometimes they're like, I'm going to kill this guy. They would openly talk about how they're going to kill you. And it's like, so the next time that you feel like you have a stressful day at work, just imagine that was my environment. And so one day they start talking about me. They're talking about what they're gonna kill me. They're gonna rape me. Yes, they talk about how they're gonna rape you and then kill you. And this is just a Tuesday at work, right? And but I remember hearing this other guy. These two guys are talking, and one of these guys, Van Meter, he's an asshole. We're gonna kill him. And this other guy goes, man, I wouldn't do that if I was you. Well, why not? And I don't know, man. He's a crazy ass Navy SEAL. And I remember sitting there, and I looked at the guy I was working with. I was like, Navy SEAL. Here, you learn not to give a lot of information about yourself to the prisoners.
Yeah.
But I guess somewhere either I slipped up and said I'd been in the Navy, or somebody else said that I'd been in the Navy. That was it. It said I was in the Navy. Okay, that was it. That's all it was said. Then they were trying to figure out why this white, at that time, I was smaller then than I am now. Small white guy comes in here and, can be commanding and, command the place. And I'm doing so with confidence. And they're trying to figure out when clearly these 40 guys could take me out in, 10 seconds. But why is it that I have so much confidence about myself? And they drew the conclusion that I must know stuff. That I must know how to, I must be like Bruce Lee, and I can take them all out in 10 seconds. And so they came to the conclusion, I must be some sort of a special forces Navy SEAL kind of guy, because otherwise there's no way in hell I would walk through there with the confidence that I had. And I was looking at my buddy that I was working with, and he just looked at me and goes, roll with it, man. Roll with it. He goes, the fact that they think that is actually keeping you safe. And I that was the first time I was like, you know what? That's actually a very good point. As long as they think I'm some sort of a Navy SEAL, that's actually good for me, because it prevents me from having issues down the road. And that mindset became important later, like when I was in the FBI. One of the things at the FBI that was important, I used to tell newer agents when I taught at the academy, I used to tell the new agents that it's not so much what we can do, it's so much what the public thinks we can do.
Huh.
And don't ever ruin that, because you can always use that to your advantage. But I learned that in the jail, a very important lesson. And then later, that probably kept me from dying on the streets of D.C. because, like I mentioned, we're patrolling by ourselves. And the fact it's really how you carry yourself on the street. Not necessarily that you can take out everybody on the street. It's just they think that you can take them out. And that prevents a lot of trouble. I learned that prevents a lot of trouble from occurring. Very important lessons.
Yeah, I mean, that's a ton of important lessons and a ton of important things to take from this. How did this stuff start to, I guess, maybe, was it always at the forefront when the drinking became extreme, or did you lose some of that command you're talking about?
So I would say during this period is when it started to escalate. But in the beginning, so the reasoning behind the drinking started to shift a bit. And here's what I mean by that. So when you go from local law enforcement to federal law enforcement, they're very different animals. Very different animals. And the threats change. So when I was in the corrections, and then certainly in the police department, this is shift work. Days, evenings, midnights, and being the new guy, forget about days. You're just doing evenings and midnights. If you're the new guy, if it's a holiday, you're working it. If it's overtime, you're working it. If it's, my wife used to call me the vampire. I never saw daylight during this period. It was always evenings, midnight. And when I got to the police department, the only time I saw daylight is when I was going to court, and then you would leave court and then go back to the street and work at night. So the shift work is very damaging to your whole physiological system. You can't get a circadian rhythm down. You can't, your sleep cycles, which are very, very important. I know now, back then, that whole period of my life, I don't remember sleeping very much. And then, by the way, we ended up having a new kid. That's when my son was born. So any parent out there knows that you're not getting a lot of sleep when you have a young child. Now throw on shift work on top of that. Now, when I moved, so I decided I was going to take whatever the first police department came up was in the area that I was working. That was Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. So I went there, and this is the mid 90s, so height of the crack epidemic, and we were averaging like a shooting per week when I was there. So imagine 100% adrenaline dump 100% of the time. Okay, there were no slow days in D.C. It was man with gun, naked man with knife, another man with a gun, domestics, interspersed with traffic stops, which was usually gangbangers that you're pulling over. It was rough. I mean, it was a rough department to work in. And so imagine what that does to your physiology when you have your body's not designed to have that sort of adrenaline dumped into it every single day. That's where, if I had to pinpoint the escalation in the drinking, that was really where it started, because you start, it's not like you come home at night. Well, hey, honey, how was your day at work? Oh, great. I was late on a project and my boss wanted to talk to me, and she just rambles on and on and on. She frustrates me. Good night. Well, how was your day? Oh, well, I got into 3 chases, and I had a guy pull a knife on me, wrestled him down. Oh, by the way, we picked up a dead baby at this, and but otherwise, just a typical Tuesday. Have a good night, honey. That's not the way it works, right? It's a lot of trauma every single day, and the way that what I believe the only way I could learn to sleep or could sleep would be to drink a little bit, and that's what I did. And those of you that are listening, I have since found out that it's absolutely not true. Alcohol does not help you sleep. In fact, detracts from it, but I didn't know that back then. So that's what I was doing.
Anything to turn off the lights at that point, right?
Right.
Because you're not coping otherwise in your job. I mean, you want to talk about an adventure, a dark adventure. If there's one instance you can pinpoint in that experience working as a DC cop, I don't want to get us too far off track, but what was it? Is there one defining moment of that craziness, what it was like to work on the streets in DC?
Oh my God. It was every day. It was like 15 years compressed into about 2.5 years. There wasn't any one experience. Again, I think it was the good and the bad coupled with, I think, I'll give you 3 maybe short instances of like when I knew this was like joke time was over, like this is real. I remember I was the first officer on the scene at Washington Hospital Center. And what had happened was a patient was being brought in with some sort of a wound. I don't even know what the wound was, but the guy was brought in, and he was in part of a gang conflict. In DC, they were called crews at the time. They're gangs, but they call them crews in DC. And they got into a dispute, and whoever he was fighting with decided to end it, knew that this guy was going to the hospital. And so he goes into the lobby of the hospital, puts a gun to his head, and blows his head off. And so this guy's head is like all over the lobby of Washington Hospital Center. And I show up, and now I didn't know that. We just got a call for shots fired in this place. And so I come into the lobby.
So this guy murdered him in the lobby.
Yeah, just blew his head off. And I'm walking around the lobby, and I'm walking in this stuff, and I actually didn't know what it was. And then one of the nurses had to point out to me that I was walking through this guy's brain matter, is what it was. Didn't even know it. Yeah. And that's when I looked around, and I'm like, oh my God. Wow.
How do you keep moving through something like that?
You just turn it off. You just the thing is that you're so in law enforcement, it's not television. There's a lot that you become very aware that everything that you're doing is a case, right? What I'm doing, I have to document everything that I'm seeing, smelling, hearing, everything that you hear. It becomes very mechanical. Like other people are obviously concerned about their safety. So you have to make sure the guy's not still there, that this is not an ongoing scene. Remember, I'm first officer at the scene, right?
Yeah.
And then you have people and this is the strange thing is, people act really weird when this happens. So obviously something traumatic happened. This guy's brain is all over the lobby of this place. But I remember distinctly, like, there was a doctor and a nurse, and they're kind of like the nurse wants her purse and the doctor wants his wallet, and that's all they care about. They're like, do you understand that this is a crime scene? You understand what just happened here? Yeah, but that's my wallet. I need my wallet over there. Oh, that's my purse over there. And you're like, look, I don't give a damn about your purse.
Yeah.
And they're just focused on, hey, I need my purse. I need my purse, my purse. And so people act really weird. It's like they can't grasp the significance of what just happened. And then you know that you have to document every little thing that goes on and preserve it until you can turn the scene over to somebody else. So it becomes very mechanical in that way. Now that creates problems in your personal life, because when traumatic things happen in your personal life with your wife, or, what's important to your wife and to your kids, the fact that, like I gave the example, my wife might come home and say, oh, I went to a meeting and my boss was late and she just rambled on for 2 hours, and, and I was going to pull my hair out. And, and when you're a cop, you come home and you think, really, that's your biggest problem today? You downplay everybody else's problems because their problems aren't as big as the problems you're dealing with.
And at the time,
that creates a lot of interpersonal relationships.
And at the time, you're drinking a lot, and so that's how that's how you're coping. What are you drinking? I mean, how much are you drinking on a typical night towards this period?
In the grand scheme of things, it didn't seem like a whole lot. I might have maybe 3 glasses of wine and half a pint of vodka.
Okay.
And it's like I became a chemist. Like that was like the mixture that would help me sleep.
Uh-huh.
And it's like you become your own scientist at that point.
Oh,
Here's
yeah.
I'm
the worst chemist in the world, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so that it seemed to kind of steady me out, and it seemed to kind of like mellow me out, and I could go to sleep. Now, later, at some point, I get hired by the FBI. Now, remember I had told you that my home of record was in Tampa, Florida, right? Now, I get out of the Navy, and my home of record now is Baltimore, Maryland, because I'm living in Maryland at this point. I'm working in D.C., but I'm living in Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And what I didn't know was that I needed to get my package for the FBI transferred to the Baltimore office, because you hire through an office. And so I didn't hear anything from the FBI for a long time, like maybe 4 or 5 years. Didn't hear anything. And finally, I called up. I was like, hey, what's the status of this application? And they figured out, oh, wait a minute. You're living in Maryland. No, the package needs to come up to Baltimore. Well, they did that. And one day I'm out on the street. This is one of the few times I worked the day shift. And this is when cell phones were starting to come out. And one day I'm doing a traffic stop, and I got these guys like 4 deep in a car, gangbangers. And I'm by myself, and the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's like, hey, this is Mike. Yeah, this is the FBI. And I'm thinking my buddies are screwing with me.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, FBI. And they go, no, really, this is so-and-so from the Baltimore office. And hey, do you have a minute? I said, well, yeah, kind of. I'm on a traffic stop right now. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, you've been stopped by the police? I said, no, I am the police, and I've stopped somebody else. And they're like, what? I said, yeah, look, I'm a cop. I've got a car stopped, and no offense, but can we get to the point? I got like 4 guys here stopped, and they're like, where are you? And I said, I'm in Washington D.C. Wait, are you a D.C. cop? Yeah. And they said, oh my God, what the hell are you doing talking to us if you've got? And I said, well, you called me. What am I doing talking to you? Yeah. You called me. What do you want? And they're like, oh, we'll make this quick. Hey, can you get to Baltimore next week on such and such date for your phase 2? And can you do that? Can you come to oh, yeah, okay. So I did. And I went up and I did my phase 2. And I won't bore you with the process, but eventually got hired and went into the FBI. And that's really where I guess sort of the next phase of the development of alcoholism started. If you kind of want me to roll through that real quick.
Talk to me about, because I don't want to keep you here forever. We got like another 25 minutes.
Yeah.
What is that like, that next phase that brings you to your knees in 2012?
All right. So what happened from that point is, and I want to start off by saying this is not meant to badmouth anybody. It's not to attack my previous organization. Because as you know, and I know, addiction ultimately is about you. It's not about situations. It's about how you respond to situations, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I had mentioned earlier that federal law enforcement, the FBI in particular, is a very different type of law enforcement than what I was doing. And I'm going to caveat that with saying that I enjoyed being a police officer. I enjoyed work. If I could get paid when I was getting paid towards the end of my career, if I could get paid that and go back and work patrol, I would do it today. I love patrol. I'm one of those weird guys that I just enjoy engaging the public. You get to federal law enforcement, it's a very different animal, and it's very long-term investigations. It's very, you have cases that, I started when I got to Dallas as my first office, and I started, and 10 years later, I'm still working the same case.
And there's how much interaction is there with people?
It depends on the case.
Okay.
It depends on the case, and actually, a lot of times, the cases you're not actually having any interaction with the subject, because half the time these people don't even know that you're looking at them.
Yeah.
It's interactions with attorneys, and it depends if you're working a white collar case, banks and subpoenas and other law enforcement agencies. A lot of interaction there, but not with the subject. And I missed that, actually. I missed the day to day, talking to the person and building the rapport with them and all of that. And you kind of miss that to a large extent in the FBI. And the types of people that come into the FBI very different than the people that go into police work. In the FBI, some of the people are highly, highly educated, which is great on one end, but you also have to remember that many of these people have never, when you're talking about bad guys, the people that come into the FBI are, for the most part, are people that were very high in their class in high school, very high in college. I mean, PhDs, you get all those kinds of people. And in working with the bad guys, most of the FBI agents would never even go near anybody. If you saw one of these people on the street, you would go to the other side of the street. Whereas, cops usually gravitate towards that.
Yeah.
Very different mindset. And that hit me, right off the bat. And because they're long-term investigations, things that I was making life and death decisions as a police officer every single day, just on my own. The only time you talk to a supervisor was after you took action, and then you would go and you talk to your supervisor. Whereas in the bureau, everything had to be done up front. And I joke about it, but it's not far from the truth. I felt like I had to get 10 letters of approval to go to the bathroom, and that was just like, it was tough for me to accept that. It was like I went from freedom and engagement to restriction, oversight. There was a lot of politics that started coming in the office, which was completely foreign to me. The mentality I had, in my entire career was, particularly in law enforcement, we are about solving crimes. And if the evidence led to my mother committing the crime, then I would be the first one to arrest my mother. Whereas, in the bureau, it was kind of like, kind of pick and choose who you're going to go target, those types of things. So those things started to settle in with me. I'm like, not sure that I really like this.
Yeah.
But but you got to remember, but at this point, I'm like in my early mid 30s. By then, I've got a couple of kids, and life stage reality sets in that you're like, okay, the pay for a law enforcement job, it's a good paying job. My wife had stopped working full time in the Navy, gave that career up to come support me in my dream. And I remember having, within the first 2-3 years, like, hey, let's talk about this. I really enjoyed what I was doing over here. I think I want to go back to that. And it was, well, too bad.
Yeah.
Too bad. We're here. You're the sole provider for for us and the kids. And your happiness is really of no concern of mine. You have responsibilities. And I was like, okay. We call that the golden handcuffs, where you kind of like at that life point where, it's not about you, and it's not about, and there's reasons why you do that. But I was not happy with the bureau. I was starting to see some things. I was starting to see some corruption. I was starting to see, one of those. And I think part of it with me is I'm a real idealist too, that I take an oath to the Constitution. I take all that stuff seriously, like very, very seriously. And there were some people that I worked with. I'm like, I'm not so sure you're taking this as seriously as I am, and you're getting a little loose with. And I don't agree with all those things. but I was getting really disenchanted with some of the stuff that I was seeing, but I felt trapped. And that's where the drinking started to take. If I could really pinpoint the serious progression, it was during that period.
So what started to happen?
Drinking wise, it became, now granted, it was a lot of pressures too. I was working some pretty big cases, pretty high visibility cases. I was working some undercover operations. The way that these things work, you have undercover agents that work undercover, obviously, but what people don't realize, and they never show on TV, is behind the scenes, there's all the case agents and the people that really run the case. And that was me. I was the one because I was in a position where I had been attached to an undercover operation from the minute I left the academy. Actually, was thrown into, back in those days, it was a healthcare fraud. This is pre 9/11, so we worked things other than terrorism. It's different these days, but back then I was working a healthcare fraud undercover operation. But so I was the guy that was doing all the proposals. I was doing all the relations with headquarters, the budgets, the money, all those, running the sources, all that kind of stuff, the behind the scenes stuff, which is very technical, very detailed, and a lot of pressure. And in fact, there's anybody that's going to get jammed up in the operation, it's that guy, because because they're being audited financially, and we're throwing $300,000 around like that's just every day.
Yeah.
And you have to be accountable to that. So, but I'd learned how to do that. And so when I went to my next squad, it was, hey, aren't you that guy didn't you run that operation over there? Well, we're going to do an operation. Okay. So every squad I went to, I was like that guy.
Yeah.
And, and that's not to mention my own cases that I'm working. And, so just a lot of stress. And so the drinking started, unhappiness, disenchantment, but a lot of stress on top of that. And then the drinking just progresses. And that if it snuck up on you overnight, you would notice it. But it doesn't sneak up on you overnight. It takes years for this to progress, or at least it did in my case, to the point to where one day you wake up and you're like, holy shit, I drank a lot. Now, my wife had noticed this. She had noticed it early on. It started unknowns to me at the time, going to Al-Anon meetings. And then it was getting to hey, you really need to stop drinking. I started putting on a lot of weight. I was starting to have health issues, and I'd always been somebody that was very conscientious about my health. And so
how much you drinking
out,
on a real bad day?
It could be as much as 1.5 liters of wine, with some vodka or a beer put on top of that. Yeah. That would just be like daily, stuff, which is a lot. I mean, that's a lot of drinking.
For but that's what we do. I mean, and we get used to that, and so that becomes normal, and that's bad news for us and for anybody around us.
Yeah, absolutely, and it takes its toll on your health. And I was having, health issues that I should not. Somebody that came from sort of like the physical fitness background that I was coming from, I shouldn't have been having those issues. And it was all attributed to my drinking. And now I'm going to point out also, remember, I said that law enforcement has a culture of drinking. Well, the FBI does too. And, so in the early part of it, it really wasn't noticeable because it's, people don't think of it, but the FBI is a drinking culture as well. All the federal agencies are. And so to a certain extent, it was just, I was doing what everybody else was doing, but then it just got worse and worse. And I won't go through all the details and the drunkalog, because I don't know that it's really relevant other than it progressed. And
was there one major instance where the bottom fell out?
Yeah, well, the beginning of the end is this, where, I mentioned my wife was bringing it up, and then she would threaten, and anybody that goes through addiction, you have the threats, and her not understanding it was, you don't love me, you don't love the kids, you don't love the job anymore. What are you doing here? What are you doing to us? Type of thing, which I know now has nothing to do with it, but she was going to Al-Anon, and she kept threatening me, you need to go to AA meetings. And I started going to AA meetings in Texas. It didn't mean anything to me. Didn't think anything of it. They gave me a big book. I have no idea where that big book is to this day, but that was my first introduction. That's probably 2003 or so that I was first introduced to it. But then as time went on, I came back to the East Coast, and I finally had a coworker confront me. And that was the first time anybody other than my family confront me about it. And he's like, dude, every time you come to work, you smell like alcohol. You know that, right? Now I wasn't drinking in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't drinking. It was just what he's smelling is the night before.
Sure.
And it's like, look, you can't do this. You can't smell like alcohol. And at a certain point, I transferred down to the academy, and that's when it was pointed out to me again. And it's like, hey, look, you can't be here
Teaching
and smell like alcohol because you're on display here at the academy. You're in front of students, and we have VIPs that come through. You can't have that. And the guy that confronted me there, I just knew he was going to run to the boss. That was just kind of the guy he was. I knew that. And so I went running to the boss to get to, I go into agent mode. Like I'm going to cover up and I'm going to get into the EAP program. And like a good agent, I don't have any intention of getting well. I just have intentions to get this guy off my back.
Yeah.
And I don't want my boss on my back. And so I ended up in detox number 1 and treatment number 1 at that point, because I figured that's how I could protect myself. It was all about protection.
What year is this? Like
point.
2011, 2010? Ballpark it.
It was, I think, 2010.
Okay.
Actually. Yeah.
Right. So you're hanging on in 2010 to.
Yeah.
Because that's what I did, right? You fight and claw to keep this existence going. Where ultimately people are calling you out for smelling like alcohol, because that's just, you're now that 24-hour ooze, right? Like that's
you're just sweating it out. You're just sweating it out of your body.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's about 2010, I would say.
And you go to treatment.
Go to treatment, right? And it didn't take, because I was, and for those of you who are listening, I was not ready.
Yeah.
I was not. My goal was to get people off my back. I developed a back problem, and I wanted to fix my back problem. I did not want to fix my drinking problem. You were on my back, and I wanted you off my back. So go back. Shockingly, didn't stop drinking, but then it started to escalate. And if you could look at a graph, it was a steep escalation at this point. And with that steep escalation, and by then people, like, the word was out. My boss had told everybody that I was in treatment, which she's not allowed to do, but it doesn't matter. She did. And now everybody's watching me, and it just put me under more pressure. And then I went to another detox, and ultimately I don't remember how many detoxes I went to, but it was several more at least. And then I went to treatment again. Ironically, went to treatment at the place where I later, a decade later, ended up interning at in my next degree program. But I was a patient at the time and still did not get sober after that.
Huh.
But then it was...
What was happening when you kept going back out? Were you just like, I'm going to figure this out? Or were you so sick, because I've been both, where you're so sick where you're just like, I don't care. Like, I'm going to continue to drink, and if I get caught, so be it. Mike Van Meter, special agent for the FBI.
You know what? I think that it was neither. For me, I remember, and I just talked to a guy this week that had a similar experience. He said he came back from treatment and he drank, and I asked him about it. I said, "So what caused you?" He goes, "I don't know." He goes, Mike, this sounds weird. I know you're not going to believe me, but I just went to the liquor store and I barely remember buying it. And the next thing you know, I'm drunk." And that was kind of the experience I had. And I told this guy, I said, "Look, I've had that experience." It was almost like my brain would just take over, and I would end up at the liquor store and not remember it. And it was almost like something overtook me.
How was your wife
I would
hanging in
go
there
do it
during all this?
Just distraught. And it was, looking back, it was so sad. And I see it in other families now where, I would go to treatment. She'd come back and she'd be like, "Oh, this is great. You're fixed. You're fixed. We're going to get back to our marriage." And then I'm drinking again. And I, looking back on those days and just seeing the sadness in her face, like just being deflated, and it hurts me to even think about it. But it was just because she just had such high hopes. And as you'll see, though, she was still thinking I was doing that to hurt her. She didn't understand at that time. She did not understand the disease, and it was like, I love you so much. Why are you doing this to us? That was kind of the mentality, but it really hurt her right now. But after that second treatment, I drank. But here's the difference. By this point, and this is what scared me, was I knew I needed to get well. I knew it, and I wanted to get well. And this is the key difference. Now I wanted to get well, but I couldn't.
Yeah, that's happened. That happened to me.
when I made that decision, and it was like I couldn't get, and that became scary.
Oh, terrifying.
And now I know that I must have been in like stage 4 alcoholism, because where it used to take tons of alcohol to get me inebriated, now I would end up in an emergency room with 2 beers. Now that's a sign physiologically that your body is shutting down.
Yeah.
But I was at the point now, and we can conclude with this. Here's the end, where it was starting to scare me. And
you're around 46 years old?
I
mean, at the time, 46, 47?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because I'm 56, almost 57.
The reason I say that is that's at no time for a healthy man for his body to be shutting down. And that's what's happening.
No. Ironically, when you look at the statistics too, that's usually in the mid 40s is when a lot of men decide to, you're either going to continue with this on until you die, or you're going to get better. If you look at the numbers, the mid 40s, it's kind of like okay, what are we going to do? We're going to die, or we're going to get better.
Yeah.
And I actually fell into that statistic. So,
you said we're going to
very little
conclude
alcohol.
with this, your story, yeah.
Yeah. And so here I am, blackout drinking. And one day I wake up in the emergency room, and there's my wife and my son, who at that point was about maybe 11, 12 years old. And I had this lady from the county standing over me, and I have no idea why I'm in the emergency room. And she's asking me why I wanted to die. And I said, what? What? And she said, sir, why did you want to take your life? And I'm like, who are you talking to, sir? And then she's like, do you know why you're here? I'm like, and I'm looking at my wife and my kid. I'm like, are they okay? And they're like, sir, we're here for you. Tell me what happened. And she's like, you don't know what happened last night, do you? And what had happened was I drank into a blackout. To this day, I have no recollection of this. And I'm in the garage, and apparently I was drunk and was about to kill myself with a gun. And my son walked out, and he asked me what I was doing. And I said, I can't stop drinking, and I'm just going to go ahead and end it. You guys will be better off. I'm just going to end this. And he goes, Dad, I don't think that's such a good idea. Why don't we go talk to Mom? How about we do this? How about we go talk to Mom? And apparently I said, well, why don't you just go ahead and do it for me? I'm too drunk. And he said, well, tell you what, let's go talk to somebody. And he went and he got my wife, and I ended up in the hospital, and there I was. And so I knew at that point, sitting in the hospital, that was it. That was something really needs to be done. Joke time is over. And my wife came over, and she started stroking my hair, and we've been together since we were 19 years old. And she said, behind all the gray and the wrinkles, I still see the young man that I fell in love with. And she said, I thought that you didn't love me. I thought that this was about you weren't trying hard enough. And I thought that if you were going to die, you were going to die in a plane crash. You were going to get stabbed. You were going to get shot. You would die of cancer, whatever. But I didn't think it was going to be alcohol that would take you from me. She goes, but I know that that's what it is. And she goes, I didn't believe it was a disease, but I clearly see it now. This is a disease, and you're going to die. Now, what you need to know is I'm not going to threaten you anymore. I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to leave. I will be with you to the end, but it's not long from here. I know that's what's going to happen. And I, at that moment, Pete, I looked up and I had like this vision in my mind. Like I'm picturing myself in the grave, like I'm laying in the grave, because that's where I was headed. And I had 2 different scenarios. And one was I could see my wife and my kids standing over the grave, and it's just them. There's no one else. And my son looking down into the grave and saying, what a shame. What a shame. That man could have done so much for his family, his country, his community, but he pissed it away. And then the other vision was my family and people around the grave. And everybody's sad. And then my son says, this is not a time to be sad. This is a celebration of life. Because if you want to know how to live life, he just did it. He overcame his disease and his demons. And he went on to do great things for his family, his community, and his country. And if you want to know how to live life, folks, that's how you do it right there. And that's when I made the decision that I wanted to, that's what I wanted. I kind of pictured the rest of my life by looking at the end of my life and what did I want people to say about me when I was gone. And that has been the driving motivator to get me into recovery. And it was not easy. That first year was very, very difficult. And if you're in your first year of recovery, know
I
that
got a
it's
huge smile.
difficult.
That's an incredible story. I just got to stop you for a second. That's unbelievable. But so you mentioned your first year. What was the hardest thing about you for your first year that you were about to say?
The physiological pull. Your body is healing. Your brain is healing. You're getting your vitamins, minerals. There's a lot of physiology that needs to correct itself, and your brain needs to correct itself. And I think that pull, like that obsession to drink, is still there. And for me, it took about a year and a half for much of that to go away. But you have to remember, it never completely goes away, ever. But like the constant draw, like where it was a daily battle, like the desire to drink every day occurred in the beginning, which I don't experience, and you probably don't experience anymore.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't.
Now that's the danger too. The danger is you can let your guard down. But in the early days, it was that pull. And so I was on Antabuse, which is the drug that makes you get sick if you drink on it. I was taking GABA, a lot of heavy multivitamins, stuff like that to get everything re-regulated. Sleep, getting my sleep patterns back. But you know what? So I drank one last time after that, and I'll tell people that.
How long between like when you were sober and you put some time together and then you drank again?
When I left that hospital room, I think it was about a day. A day.
Okay.
And then, but here's what happened.
Yeah.
They put me on Antabuse. And I remember I'm in the bedroom and I snuck a beer and my wife walked in and she looked at me and she goes, "You drank, didn't you?" And I'm like, "No, what would make you say that?" And she said, "Come here, dumbass." And I went in the bathroom. She said, "Look in the mirror." And my face was beet red. She said, "You took Antabuse and you drank on it. You're a dumbass." She goes, "Have a good night." And if you know anything about Antabuse, it was not a good night. But that, Pete, was August 11th of 2012. And so I consider the next full day, 24 hours, is my sobriety date, because that was the first full 24 hours of no alcohol. And that was it, August 12th. That's also my wedding anniversary. And I've not had any alcohol since then. In this coming August, it'll be 10 years.
What are some of the things? That's just an amazing story. And I think you did a great job, whether on purpose or not, about the theme was your wife throughout a lot of it. She kept appearing. And like you said, she was there to the very end. Like she told you. What do you tell somebody that's in her shoes today dealing with a guy like you in August of 2012?
Well, I will say that everybody's story is different. And so the unfortunate part is not everybody gets sober. You and I both know that. Try not to give up, before the miracle happens. Try to stick in there. But I will say this, that you do have to protect yourself. And if you're in an abusive relationship, under no circumstances should you stay in an abusive relationship. Having said that, also, people have a right to do what they're going to do. And my wife told me, and if you can listen to my podcast where my wife actually tells her version of the story that I just told you. And the conclusion she came to was
recovery is possible. Recovery is possible.
Yeah, recovery is possible is the podcast.
Yeah.
And she is episode number 1 and episode 100. So the two, but she tells the story. And one of the things that she had decided was that now we're religious people. My wife and I are, right? My wife is very, very religious. And so to her, it was a marriage vow, and she struggled with this. Like, what do I do? He's abandoned me, and she had resolved herself that unless I was physically abusive to her, she was not going to leave. But it also did not mean that she needed to be present for the self-destruction. So her plan was to not divorce, but to leave and just live separate from me. Now that ended up not happening. But so if you're the spouse, know that this is progressive. It's a disease. It does not mean that your loved one doesn't love you. They do love you. It's just that they have a disease that has hijacked their brain, and there is a solution for it, but they have to be directed to that solution, and they have to accept that solution. And all fingers need to point to that solution. Every discussion needs to be to the solution, and don't badger the person. No amount of badgering, nagging, complaining is going to do anything. It's just going to be very calm, very simple. Here's the solution. You know what the solution is. When you're ready, let me know. I'll go to the ends of the earth to help you out. Okay. But you're not going to abuse me. You're not going to do any of those things. But I'm also not going to talk to you about, things that don't exist. And when I can smell alcohol on you and you're telling me that you weren't drinking, I'm not going to debate you on it. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to complain about it. It is what it is. I'm not stupid. I smell it. You're drinking. And, you know what the solution is. Let me know when you're ready. I mean, that's kind of an oversimplified way of thinking
I think
of it.
that's what we try to do is keep it simple for people. Last thing for you before I got to let you go. What do you tell people that are struggling? Now you're becoming, not only is your experience spanning a decade, but this is now your craft, and you're somebody who is terribly bright and had great success. What do you tell people based on all this knowledge and experience? What do you tell people that are going through it today, that are struggling and just can't stop, but they want to? They're at that point that you were at.
Well, for me, the difference was the disease model of it. As long as I thought that what I was doing was something, it was a moral issue. It was defined whether I was a good or a bad person. It never meant anything to me, and I never had progress. Once I understood and was taught the disease model of addiction and that it was something that I had no control over, A, that made sense to me, and B, it took the pressure off of being a good or a bad person. Because after all, I love my wife. I love my children. I love, there's other people in my life that I love. It wasn't that I knew intuitively that had nothing to do with it, but I couldn't understand why I kept drinking. And I heard it said to me once, I think it was in treatment that I heard this, that, here in Virginia, when things start to bloom, I have horrible allergies. So I get snot and I cough and I wheeze and all those kinds of things. And I remember this counselor said to me, so imagine if I said to you, hey, Mike, you know what the problem is? You know why you have those allergies? Because you don't love your wife. You don't go to the gym enough. You don't take care of your body. You don't spend time with your kids. And you would look at me and go, what the hell does that have to do with anything? And the answer is nothing. And he goes, it's the same with addiction. It has absolutely nothing to do with it. Your body has a reaction. You have allergies. Webster's definition of an allergy is the body having an abnormal reaction to a substance. You, with alcohol, are having an abnormal reaction to a substance. So what do? You avoid the substance. It's easy. You don't have any issues when you don't drink. Just like if you're not exposed to that allergen out in the environment, you don't react to it. It's that simple, Mike. It has nothing to do with you being good or bad. That kid over there can't eat crabfish. That kid can't eat peanuts, and you can't drink.
Yeah.
But we don't look at that kid that can't eat peanuts and go, that poor kid, oh my God, his life's over with. He'll never have a life because he can't eat peanuts. How ridiculous is that? Well, It's the same thing. He told me, all we do, you gave up everything so you could do one thing, and that's to drink. All we're asking you to do is to give up the one thing, that being drinking, so you can have everything. That's what we're asking.
And you feel like that, and that's what you did.
Yeah. Yeah, and life has gotten exponentially better. I wouldn't go back to drinking today. Like, I talked to this family yesterday. I mentioned earlier I have a law enforcement officer I'm working with, and he's already relapsed. He's come out of treatment, and his wife is, and it's just so sad. His wife, is calling me, and I can just feel the pain, and because she's one of those people. Just like my wife, he comes out of treatment, and she's like, "Oh, I got my husband back. It's all going to be good." And he's already relapsed, and to hear the pain, you know this, Pete. It's when I sit and I talk to this woman about her husband, I just think, but the grace of God go and I'm just so thankful that I am no longer doing that to my wife, because I was doing that to my wife. And I'm just so grateful for that.
Well, and you flipped it around, and now you're carrying a message and you're inspiring and helping people. And that is, talk about beating the odds, man. Mike, I cannot thank you enough. It's just fantastic.
Well, I enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, you're a fascinating guy and a great guest, man. I can't thank you enough.
All right, brother. We'll take care.
Thanks so much for listening to the Payoff with Pete. Once again, I'm Pete Souza. And of course, we are part of the Rogue Media Network. All kinds of good podcasts you can find at roguemedianetwork.com. And of course, you can find this podcast and all those other ones wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, other spots like that.
This has been a Rogue Media podcast.
Are you a podcaster? Let's talk podcast hosting. Are you tired of your current podcast host? Need real support and a community that gets it? At Rogue Media Network, we offer top-tier podcast hosting services to help you thrive. From hosting and distribution to dedicated support, we've got you covered. Starting as low as $25 a month. Join our community of passionate podcasters today. Contact us at hello@roguemedianetwork.com.